He would say the same thing Sun Tzu would say. You have to know your enemy well enough so that you can either set your conditions and avoid the bullets or the conflict. The other thing is, and Clausewitz said this too, you have to be really focused on what's called Clausewitz called it the center of gravity. It's that point of inflection. It's that point where the battle can go either way. And Sun Tzu and Clausewitz both say that's where the leader needs to be.
We are here with Dr. Todd Henshaw from Wharton. He has been an invited professor at our international sessions, and he has agreed to answer some questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
The first question is, what are the differences and the similarities between executive leadership and military leadership?
That's a question I get all the time because of my background. I was a military officer for a long time. It might surprise people to hear me say that I don't think there are as many differences as they might think. So I'm saying good leadership is good leadership. Military leaders need to be strategic. They need to anticipate change. They need to be able to make very quick decisions. Military leaders are very good at developing their people, growing the bench or the pipeline. A lot of executive leadership actually comes from research that's been done in the military. So the naval research, the Army research, the U.S. government provides a lot of funding for this type of research, not just leadership, but psychology and motivation and other things. A lot of corporate strategy comes from the military. So the one thing I can say about these two seemingly different areas that are really very similar for me, my job is really to provide bridges between my own experience and executive experience. The one thing I can say is that companies are starting to deal with not necessarily battlefield conditions, the chaos. We use the term VUCA. It's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The military use that to describe combat because you're not really sure what's going to happen in the next minute or so. A lot of information is contradictory. You need to make decisions without complete analysis information. I think the business world is moving closer to that world. Not that business leaders are dodging bullets or anything like that, but I think the complexity of the business world and the rapid change that people experience makes it much more like the ambiguity that military officers have to deal with. So my approach is VUCA. This is a situation you're going to have to deal with, and we can learn many things from military leaders, I think, to help them build that bridge.
Yes, in my sessions of strategy, I say that we have stalled many concepts.
Borrowed
sounds better. Yes, like strategy, like after action review. What are the main characteristics of a good leader, of a good executive leader?
So some of the things I talk about, and I've studied, I've researched. I also work in consulting with senior people. I think the ability to anticipate, instead of being in the middle of change, being able to see that change is coming. So being strategic in perspective, not just paying attention to the daily kind of running the organization. There's some of it you would call a capacity or an ability, but also I think it's a learned skill to look farther out and to look more broadly at the organization. I think this required a process of developing leaders. If the CEO of the organization doesn't believe in growing leaders, it's very difficult to build a culture around that. I think setting the tone and building the right culture is probably the most important part. I talked this week about the type of culture that you would have in the organization that develops people, accelerates development, especially of young people. And if the CEO promotes and resources and provides a direction for that, you can grow people in the organization faster. You can have more choices about who gets promoted and how quickly they can get promoted. And I talk about leadership being from top to bottom. It's not just not just at the top of the organization.
The graphic that you make in the board about your experience at Chef, your personal life,
Yes.
it explains that what you are saying now, but it's a wonderful tool. I didn't know it, and it looks fantastic. I mean,
Yes.
very useful.
I use that because I'm trying to make the point that regardless of generation, regardless of background, experience, our job as leaders is to make connections with people. And I think the extent to which we're able to influence people relies on how connected we become. You know, a lot of people think, I don't want to get too close to my people. I have to have some kind of gap to manage them effectively. You know, instinctually, we keep people at a distance. I come from a background where I couldn't be friends with my soldiers, but I wanted them to know that I had their best interest in mind and that I was capable, and I wanted them to know enough about me that they would trust me when I made a decision. And so I think sometimes business leaders miss out on this opportunity to build these very close relationships that are built on respect and admiration and trust. Military leaders have to ask people to go into gunfire. And to be able to ask somebody to do that, they have to know that that you're competent, you're going to make a values-based decision. And there are examples where soldiers don't follow leaders because they haven't built that type of, they haven't invested in the relationship enough. So my journey line, you know, the highs and lows of my life, I like to tell executives that if they're able to be vulnerable, if they're able to open up parts of their stories that may not be so comfortable sharing, that creates an opening for somebody to make a connection.
Bonding, yes.
Yes.
So, how important was your leadership experience in the Army as an ingredient of your leadership teaching now?
How much time do we have?
One more question and then go.
Okay. That's a brilliant question, because I think there's no way that I can stand in front of a group and not reflect my military experience. Not just through examples and stories, but also I think when I say I was an officer for 24 years, I retired as a colonel. And so I led and commanded organizations all the way up through about 600 people. I tell them that I've made mistakes. I tell them that I've been in very difficult situations. I haven't always made the best decisions, but I was always trying to learn and improve. That puts me in a different place than a professor, especially with leadership. It puts me in a very different conversation with people than a professor who went university, master's, PhD, right to the classroom. So I would say I have nicks and bruises.
Yes.
I have wounds that I haven't always been a perfect leader, and so I have the bruises and scars that come, and the learning that comes from that. The other thing I'd like to share is I had this very unique career path where I led in the Army up to about 200 people, and then the Army said, we would like to get you an MBA and go teach at West Point. So I had already had, in the classroom, I was the only one, I was older than all the other students, but I had this real world command experience, which made me a little, I think, mature and experienced. Then I went to teach at West Point. So I practiced leadership, I studied leadership in business, I go teach at West Point, and then the Army said, you did really well here, but we want you to go back to the Army and lead some more. I went to Korea for a year, got my PhD, and went back to West Point. So it's this cycle, and I think this applies to executives everywhere. It's scholarship, it's practice, it's teaching and developing.
And
it's
reflection on what you have done.
the whole time. And so I'm able to say, well, this is what scholars are saying, but this is my experience. And when I teach, I try to draw on what I think is closer to reality and the truth.
Some people say that in the military, it really doesn't make sense to speak of leadership. I mean, if they give you an order, you have to follow, no? But you have explained that it is really not the case. Sometimes soldiers doesn't go with the orders if they don't think it's good for them. I think that was your message.
Another great question. I was teaching let's just say at another Ivy League school. I won't give the name. But I started this discussion of, who leaders are and why it's important to know yourself. And a student right in the front, a very sharp, gentleman, said, "Why are you talking to us about leadership? All you have to do is give orders and people do what you say." And so I was young. I was a young professor, and it really kind of made me think for a second. But my response was, if you're in a position where you have to ask somebody to charge up a hill in gunfire, is an order enough? Sometimes it is. Do you want to pull out your pistol and say, if you don't, I'm going to do this? Or do you want to have the type of relationship with your soldiers where when you ask them to do something, they really know that this is important, that you've considered the alternatives, that you know what you're doing and you know what you're saying, you know what you're asking them to do? That type of investment, that type of a relationship is what you need. And I said a version of that, and then he kind of sat back and he said, "Okay, I'm ready to listen to what you have to say." But I do feel sometimes you have to get that out of the way, because in the movies, it's like, you go up the hill and let me know, what how fast the enemy's shooting. Nobody wants to do that. Sometimes you have to go up the hill yourself first.
Yes.
And then other people.
It's leadership by example now.
Yes. And we taught cadets that rank is something you should only use when absolutely necessary. If you're using your rank and you're saying, do this because I'm an officer, I outrank you, you've given up all the other options that can build your influence and build your power. Eisenhower said this. It's much better to ask people to do something and have them say, I'd gladly follow you to do this, than say, you need to do this, or I order you to do this, because you give up so much. It actually, you have to do that sometimes.
Do you use Sun Tzu, Art of War, in your teaching?
In fact, I've taught quite a bit in China, and that question comes up all the time. Many times if I work with a company in China, they'll give me a version of they say Sun Tzu. And so when I'm in China, they ask me to talk about Sun Tzu. But there's also another guy, Sun Tzu Clausewitz, was a Prussian officer who kind of helped explain the right way to lead, organize in a military context. He talked about military strategy. And so in my growing up and learning as a military leader, I studied Sun Tzu, I studied Clausewitz. So I met an intelligence officer just a few minutes ago here in Apade. He would say the same thing Sun Tzu would say. You have to know your enemy well enough so that you can either set your conditions and avoid the bullets or the conflict. The other thing is, and Clausewitz said this too, you have to be really focused on what's called Clausewitz called it the center of gravity. It's that point of inflection. It's that point where the battle can go either way. And Sun Tzu and Clausewitz both say that's where the leader needs to be. That's where Patton was, at that critical moment, critical point. Sometimes in business, I think we think everything is important. We find it difficult to set priorities. Military leaders are trained to find that moment when everything could be positive or be negative. Intelligence guys and marketing people and salespeople in business are intelligence. They should inform decision makers and leaders about what's likely to happen so leaders can decide where to put their main effort, where to influence the most. I think that's something that we can all learn from Sun Tzu and Clausewitz.
I teach strategy fundamentals with the Battle of Agincourt. Which is a wonderful
Henry
example
V,
of
right?
Henry V. This is a
Yes.
wonderful. Okay.
Yes, we take people, because Philadelphia is close to Gettysburg, we take our very senior students to Gettysburg. We have to teach them about the Civil War first, give them a little bit of history, but I love to do that. So this is where my military profession and teaching leadership and develop. It all comes together, so I get very excited about it, passionate about it. There's nothing like being in central Italy, going through the mountains, or being on the beaches of Normandy, physically feeling how wide the beach is. And soldiers, when the ramp would drop, they had to run out of the vehicles into gunfire. And then the nature of leadership in that moment. We would call that a leadership moment. How people respond, whether some people rise to the challenge or whether people stay in the vehicle. Well, the vehicles went back to the ship. There was no turning back. But those things are interesting. Those moments are interesting to me. I think businesses have those moments too. In fact, I showed this cruise ship video where the captain was supposed to be there, but he abandoned his ship. Yes, those moments are really, I think, important, significant, but also I think they're great teaching moments for us.
Thank you very much. It has been a wonderful experience for me. Thank you very much.
I enjoyed it very much. Nice to talk to you.